Hello and welcome to my video essay on the politics of translation, a 1992 essay by Gayatri Spivak. So, starting in the 1990s, translation theorists became more interested in cultural studies and post-structuralism, but they began also exploring the links between gender and translation, power relations and translation, and globalization and translation. And these issues are essential to postcolonial studies, which emerged as a major field of inquiry and influenced translation studies tremendously during this time. Intellectuals like Gayatri Spivak and Homi Bhabha, two of the foremost postcolonial theorists, started exploring how imperialism wills images of other peoples and cultures as it simultaneously masks underlying power relations. So their interests were in providing more ethically and politically inflected ways to read language and translations in colonial and post-colonial contexts. Gayatri Spivak, apart from being one of the key post-colonial theorists, is also a feminist thinker and a translator. She's famous for her translation of Derrida's Of Grammatology, a major text of deconstruction which helped usher deconstruction into the English-speaking world. Her translator's preface is still widely read today. But she's also known, perhaps less so, for her translations of feminist Bengali writer Mahasveta Devi, and we get a glimpse of that in the article that I will be going over today. Most of Spivak's work focuses on excluded, subaltern, especially women who are still being marginalized despite majority groups' claims of democracy. Thus, translation is not her main field of interest. In the article that we go over, however, she seems to acknowledge the importance of translation in intercultural communication. Overall, we can say that in this essay, Spivak's primary concern is translation of non-European languages into European languages, or to be more precise, translation of Bengali into English and French, and to be even more precise, translation of women writers in Bengali into English and French. Since Spivak's essay brings together feminist, postcolonial, and post-structural approaches, we might imagine her as asking, what is the task of the feminist translator of non-European languages? Spivak takes up this question on the first page. She says, the task of the feminist translator is to consider language as a clue to the workings of gendered agency. And we notice in the first sentence of the same paragraph she's saying that meaning is not transferred in translation, it is constructed. And based on that understanding, she wants to consider the role played by language for the translator. Who is the agent, she says. The translator is the one who acts, but this action is really only partial because even in acting, the intention is not fully present to itself. And that is to say that the translator is often not even aware of everything that is happening in the translation. Along the same lines, she says, the writer is written by her language. So the writer who is being translated also writes with her own ideological position. This means, of course, that the writer's agency, and presumably she means the Indian woman writer here, or perhaps the non-European woman writer in general, she writes her agency differently from the way the British woman writer does. Why? Well, simply because the historical context is different. So the question is, how can a translator translate with this in mind? This is what she asks next. Spivak says, how does the translator attend to the specificity of the language she translates? There is a way in which the rhetorical nature of every language disrupts its logical systematicity. If we emphasize the logical at the expense of these rhetorical interferences, we remain safe. Safety is the appropriate term here, because we are talking of risks of violence to the translating medium. So here she is already setting up a kind of duality in language, logic and rhetoric. So we might be asking, well, what is a logical translation? Well, quite simply, as she is saying here, the logical translation is the safe translation, the translation that does not take risks. It goes along with the majority. It is the translation that ignores the rhetorical aspect of the language. And on the other side, we have rhetoric. And rhetoric disrupts logic and interferes with it, and so the rhetorical translation is risky. But risky how, or risky why? And that's because it doesn't go along with the majority, or with the dominant norms. And now she wants to give an example which she takes from her own preface. She says, quote, I must overcome what I was taught in school. the highest mark for the most accurate collection of synonyms strung together in the most proximate syntax. I must resist both the solemnity of chaste Victorian poetic prose and the forced simplicity of plain English that have imposed themselves as the norm. The term impose here is very important. And then she says, translation is the most intimate act of reading. I surrender to the text when I translate. So what does she mean by surrendering to the text? She means paying attention to the rhetoric of the language, and this of course means rejecting the logical translation, or the kind of translation that she learned in school, as she's saying here. So first we should ask, so what happens when we translate logically, and how can we avoid it? This she takes up in the next paragraph, where she says that when we translate logically and ignore the rhetoricity of the text, we flatten it out, and we are taking an instrumental approach to language, which has the political implication of attempting to control the other and control how they are represented. So the attempt of controlling language means trying to render the incomprehensible more manageable, in the sense of making something more communicable. So when Spivak says, quote, yet in translation, where meaning hops into the spacey emptiness between two named historical languages, we get perilously close to it. Close to what? Close to control. If translation is the space where meaning is constructed, how must we avoid this penchant for control? She says that we must give up control by going beyond the logic so that we can pay attention to the rhetoric. And this, she says, permits fraying. The word fraying here, or frayage, is important because it means breaking new paths, and this creates new meaning outside of the colonial colonized binary representation. And as a side note, the word frayage is actually Derrida's translation of Freud's word Pannung in the German, so the word itself is steeped in psychoanalysis and philosophy. But continuing with the difference between logic and rhetoric, on the next page she says, logic allows us to jump from word to word by means of clearly indicated connections. Rhetoric must work in the silence between and around words in order to see what works and how much. So, unlike logic, rhetoric accounts for silences, which is part of the three-tiered notion of language, comprising of rhetoric, logic, and silence, which is a post-structuralist idea about language, as she herself points out. We'll see this where she writes later, quote, without a sense of the rhetoricity of language, a species of neocolonialist construction of the non-Western scene is afoot. So here she's saying that the logical translation is not a responsible translation. And this is something that she's already been suggesting throughout the essay, but here she says it more clearly. And that is that the logical translations, or translations that make the text accessible for North American or European readers, participates in Orientalism because it affirms relations of domination. If we read the following two paragraphs, we see that she directs her criticism to North American and European feminists who expect feminist writings from outside Europe to be translated into English, the language of power, and she also criticizes the European notion that all non-European literatures are the same. On the next page she says, this happens when all the literature of the Third World gets translated into a sort of with it translatees, so that the literature by a woman in Palestine begins to resemble in the feel of its prose something by a man in Taiwan. So these are logical translations because there is no attention to differences and no attention to rhetoric. And she gives a good example of the difference between logical and rhetorical translation, where she talks about the difference between two translations of Mahasvita Devi's short story. We have Spivak's translation as breast giver, which is the risky translation, and the other translator's more common and therefore safe translation as the wet nurse. And the wet nurse is safe because it is readily understandable for English speakers. But its being readily understandable has its consequences, and because the wet nurse, Spivak says, overlooks the way Devi in the original title chose to construct an uncanny word. And in contrast, Spivak's translation as breast giver is not readily understandable. It's shocking in a way, so it echoes the uncanniness of the original, while it bears traces of its Marxian and Freudian connotations. So what we should see is that the translation as wet nurse erases all of that. It flattens the original out, and this is the cost of making a text accessible. And this is all happening in just the title of a work. So how does this play out in the body of a work? This is what Spivak turns to next. She starts comparing her own translation of 18th century poetry by Ram Prasad with the translation into French by a French wife of a Bengali painter who translated it to accompany her husband's painting based on Ram Prasad's poetry. This specific poem is a song to Kali, who is a Hindu mother goddess. Spivak says that there is a longing between the poet and Kali, but she says this is not all of what is there. Even more importantly, there is a gendered tone of affectionate banter, a kind of tension there. And this is something she says that she tries to capture in her translation, but at the same time, she admits that she can't fully capture it. And this is something that the French translator just doesn't even get at all. One thing that is striking about the difference between the translations is Spivak's use of English, because it is more startling and it really asks the readers to think carefully about the meanings. And this is something that is very important, if not crucial, because Ram Prasad played with the Bengali in a kind of way that shows that the way of meaning is important here too, not just the meant. So the first line of Spivak's translation is "Mind why footloose from mother," comparing that with the French translation as "Why have you, my soul, left ma's feet?" It is already clear in the first line that the French wife's translation is readily understandable. The layers of meaning, on the other hand, and the rhetoric gets flattened out, while Spivak's is not readily comprehensible. In fact, her language is a bit defamiliarizing, which actually echoes with the original's play with language. This brings us to Spivak's later discussion of the translation, and the thing to note is that in that discussion, Spivak says that the French wife's translation is Orientalist, even though her intentions were good. But the problem is she makes the Bengali accessible to her readers by taking an instrumentalist approach to language. And this is Spivak's overall critique, which then allows her to bend the conversation to her own experience. And later Spivak asks, "What am I giving up? What am I, as a translator, giving up when making everything accessible and readily consumable for the Western reader?" So, the accessible translation is not a good translation because it flattens out the original. For instance, it erases the play of language in the original, it ignores the rhetoric, and it is just not intimate. On the other hand, the good translation takes risks by disrupting logic, by withholding explanation of the original in the translation. And this, of course, is all happening within the uneven power relations between languages. And this is something that Spivak never loses sight of, and we shouldn't either. Spivak does make a second point about being a good translator, and that is, quote, "The translator must be able to discriminate on the terrain of the original." So, in other words, the translator needs to understand how to choose a text to translate, because all non-Euro-American texts are not the same, and even not all the texts in, say, Bengali are not the same, and yet they are perceived that way. And this is what Spivak is criticizing. So we should be asking, why did Spivak choose Mahasvita Devi to translate? And she gives us her answer in the next page, and she says that the reason she chose Devi is because Devi is against the majority in India. She is a minority voice and thus cannot represent all of India. So this goes against the way people in North America and Europe see any third world writer as being necessarily representative of their nation or of the third world in general. So Spivak's decision to translate Devi affirms plurality as it affirms difference. Spivak makes the same criticism, but more to her point in terms of feminism on later pages, and we will see that Spivak is criticizing Western feminists who claim solidarity, but at the same time demand that non-European women's texts be accessible to them in English, which is again a hegemonic language and the ex-colonizers' language. So she's challenging these feminists claiming solidarity to learn the other's language intimately. And intimately is very important because she's not saying, yeah, just learn another language or learn some other languages and that solves everything. No, you must have intimacy with that language. You must be able, she says, to talk about intimate things in that language. When there is intimacy, you can surrender to the text, which means you give up your own identity in order to respect the other. So this points not only to an ethics of translation, but to an erotics of translation, which is one of Spivak's contributions to our understanding of translation. And she says, only then, when you actually learn another language intimately, and thus when you can surrender to the other's text, only then can you begin to think about solidarity. So Spivak goes on to say that while she has been discussing the case of women's writings, the same idea can be applied to other contexts, like the postcolonial in general. So this is something for all of us to consider. If we are translating a text from a postcolonial region or a text from a minority or marginalized language or dialect, the question becomes, are we making the text accessible to the dominant language? And if so, at what cost?